defenses in lymphatic system. The learning objectives will cover the tissues and organs as well as the cells of our body's defenses and also the body's response to a virus or bacterial infection. The first learning objective is describe the organs and tissues of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system has cardiovascular function as well as immune function. So we remember that the cardiovascular system involves the heart pumping blood through our body through the circulation, which includes arteries, capillaries, and finally veins, which return the blood back to the heart. Well, it turns out that we also have lymphatic vessels, and so you remember that the capillaries leak a tiny amount of fluid into our tissues. But luckily we have a lot of plasma albumin. This protein attracts the water into our capillaries. Despite that, we still have some fluid, water, and albumin that leaks out of our capillaries all day long. We also have leukocytes that can travel and migrate out of our blood vessels into the tissues. These lymphatic vessels pick up the fluid, the albumin, and even those leukocytes and return that fluid back to the veins in our chest. So all day long we have this fluid and we have these cells circulating in these lymphatic vessels, stopping along the way at lymph nodes. So this lymphatic circulation starts in your peripheral tissues and then returns this fluid back towards the veins in your chest. We call the fluid lymph or lymph fluid. So this lymphatic circulation is made up of vessels, and they're very similar to your blood vessels in that they're made of endothelial cells lining them, and some even have smooth muscle cells to help them contract. So we have lymphatic capillaries and lymphatic veins, or often just called lymphatic vessels. So the lymphatic system really has some cardiovascular system function in returning fluid back towards your veins from your systemic tissues, but also it has immune function because that fluid, that lymph, travels to lymph nodes. One thing that lymph nodes and lymphatic vessels are famous for is carrying cancer cells from our peripheral tissues around our body. So cancer cells like to make it into these lymph vessels, return to your heart, and then the heart pumps the blood, including those cancer cells, to other places so that your metastatic breast cancer can reach your brain, or maybe it can reach your liver or lungs or bones. So cancer is famous for circulating around your blood vessels, but also these lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes. So sometimes doctors will have to take out your lymph nodes because they have cancer cells in them already, or maybe they're just trying to find out if the cancer has spread. Once you remove the lymph nodes, you have now interrupted the lymphatic circulation. And so now the fluid that leaks out of your systemic capillaries will be trapped in your tissues. And so you can get swelling in your arms or your legs or in your body. If it's due to the interruption of the lymph circulation, the swelling is called lymphedema. We can get swelling in our body for other reasons that don't involve the lymphatics. So regular swelling we just call edema. It could be due to something local like a bug bite or maybe a sprained or broken ankle. You can get lots of swelling. That edema doesn't really have anything to do with the lymphatics. So remember, this lymphatic circulation goes in these vessels from the periphery back towards the veins in your chest. The central nervous system doesn't have lymphatics. So the lymphatic circulation is always continually moving fluid from our periphery back towards the veins in our chest. This lymph flow can be interrupted. Again, sometimes swelling is just due to other causes, but specifically when you interrupt the lymph flow, we call the swelling lymphedema. So in this patient here, something has caused the lymphatic flow to be blocked or interrupted. It could be due to damage of the lymphatics or removal of the lymphatics, sometimes with cancer surgery. Normally, this fluid leaks out of our systemic capillaries and is picked up by our lymphatic capillaries and circulated back to our veins. So there's a lymphatic flow from your systemic capillaries to your lymphatic capillaries. Along the way, the lymph fluid goes through these nodes. What is a lymph node? It's basically like a little pocket made by connective tissue supporting groups of immune cells. And so they're basically localized immune surveillance stations. Because the lymph flows into them as well as the blood supply, It's an ideal way for your local immune cells to know what's going on if there's an infection locally in your tissues. So inside your lymph nodes, you expect to have leukocytes like macrophages and lymphocytes. The lymph flows in there and lets those defense cells know what's going on in your peripheral tissues. There's also a blood supply to each lymph node, so they get lymph flow as well as blood flow. And if you look at histology of a lymph node, you can see it's packed with lymphocytes. All those little cells there are lymphocytes, and there's probably, if we look closely, there's probably some also leukocytes like macrophages. So pretty much you're packing your lymph node with macrophages and lymphocytes. The lymphocytes wait in there and wonder if anything's happening. The macrophages can help let them know whether you have an infection or not. But also that lymph flow carries things to the lymph node to alert them. We have our bone included in our immune system because don't forget the bone marrow has hematopoietic stem cells. Those hematopoietic stem cells can divide, creating all the different types of leukocytes that our body makes. So in our bone marrow, we make all our new leukocytes that our body has, all the different leukocytes, including neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, even eosinophils and basophils. We have a blood supply to our bone in our bone marrow, so we have arteries supplying blood to the bone marrow, veins carry blood away from the bone marrow, and so now our leukocytes can travel to and from the bone marrow using the blood vessels. Some of those leukocytes might stay in the bone marrow, but many of them will circulate around the body to your tissues, including your lymph nodes. So those lymph nodes will have lots and lots of lymphocytes, but the lymphocytes and neutrophils and macrophages and things can go live in our other tissues to do our body's defense. One of the more famous organs of our immune system is the spleen. The spleen actually has two functions. One is immune surveillance, and the other is the removal of old red blood cells from our bloodstream. If you remove your spleen, other organs can pretty much take over whatever job the spleen does. So maybe your liver removes the old red blood cells, and your bone marrow picks up the immune surveillance. So here's your spleen. If we look at your spleen, of course it has a very rich blood supply. Its job is going to be immune surveillance of our bloodstream, but also removing old red blood cells. So in order to remove the old red blood cells, we have lots and lots of macrophages inside your spleen. The little macrophages detect which old red blood cells need removal and digest them and help recycle their parts. Also, since our spleen is involved in immune surveillance, we have lots and lots of lymphocytes, T cells and B cells packed into our spleen, and they sit in there and wait for something to happen. Cells like the macrophage can help alert them whether there's an infection or not. And then specific lymphocytes will get activated. So the spleen really has two functions: immune surveillance and removal of red blood cells. The thymus is another organ of our immune system. It's found sort of in your chest above your heart. If you wonder what does the thymus do, the thymus is sort of a specific area where you're going to train a certain type of lymphocyte called the T cell. And so I like to remember T cell as thymus. So T cells actually go to the thymus to learn how to be a T cell. They either graduate or they die. So hopefully your little T cell graduates. So it goes to the thymus as a precursor cell. It learns how to be a T cell and then it graduates. And then it's a functioning T cell. And we'll learn there's different types of T cells. And they're going to go live in your body and do your defenses. So they can go back to the bone marrow, spleen, lymph nodes, or tonsils. They can go live throughout your body. So they'll be packed in places like your lymph nodes and your tonsils. So again, the bone marrow has the hematopoietic stem cells, which make all your new leukocytes, including lymphocytes. T cells in particular, they actually leave the bone marrow as pre-lymphocytes, or immature T cells. Then they go to the thymus, where they learn to be a functioning T cell. If they graduate, then they go out in your tissues and defend you. If they don't graduate, they die by apoptosis. All the rest of our new lymphocytes and leukocytes can circulate around either in the lymphatics or your blood vessels and, of course, defend you. Tonsils are a good example of localized defense tissue or lymph tissue. So if you're wondering what a tonsil is, it's really just a lump of tissue found in the epithelial and connective tissue that lines the mouth or the throat. So if we look at the throat, we see the epithelium covering it. We see the connective tissue supporting the epithelium. And really all the tonsil is a bunch of immune cells. So macrophages and lymphocytes and neutrophils, mostly lymphocytes and macrophages. And so that's what a tonsil is. It's embedded lymphatic cells or defense cells. Why put them in your mouth? Well, that's where you get exposed to a lot of stuff. So we'll put things like tonsils or tonsil-related tissues wherever we have exposed surfaces. So like our mouth, our reproductive tract, our digestive tract. So it's common to have our defense cells concentrated really underneath epithelia. So remember, mucosa is really just like moist skin. So your trachea, your vagina, your guts, your intestines all have lots and lots of defense cells right underneath that epithelium to defend you. So if we draw epithelium covering you along with some connective tissue, and then we draw some lymphatic vessels in there going to a lymph node, we can kind of see how this defense system works. So say you have strep throat inside your throat. That causes an infection, and those little bacteria then can be defended by leukocytes. Some of those leukocytes will then go and migrate to local lymphatic vessels and travel to the nearest lymph node. And what those leukocytes can do is to alert other immune cells that you have an infection. And then those immune cells can divide, create more immune cells, travel to the infection through the bloodstream, and now you've got lots and lots of activated leukocytes traveling specifically to fight that strep throat infection. So sometimes students will complain of swollen glands. Swollen glands are really swollen lymph nodes because you have lymph nodes located throughout your neck and your chest and sort of near your throat. Whenever you get an infection, you'll get a swelling of those lymph nodes, and a lot of people will call those swollen lymph glands. The next learning objective is to describe the body's defenses and explain the function of the innate defenses and adaptive defenses. So basically, how do you protect yourself? If we thought about how do we protect our country, we have things like the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, the National Guard, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, drones. You can see it gets pretty complicated. So no different. In your body, the defenses are pretty complex, and there's lots of different ways we defend our body. But we can break it down and think we have cells, we have proteins, and we have chemicals that can defend our body against anything that invades us. So what do we need defenses for? Well, we need defenses for things like bacteria, viruses. Bacteria are single-cell organisms, basically that can live on and inside our body. Sometimes we have good bacteria, sometimes we have bad bacteria. Viruses are basically biological particles. They're not really alive. They're basically like protein and RNA and DNA, but they can infect us. We also can get infected or attacked by parasites, which are multicellular organisms which can try to live in and on our body. We also can get a fungal infection, such as a yeast or a mold. We're going to focus mainly on bacteria and viruses that can infect us and make us sick. So again, the things that we're defending ourselves against include viral infected cells, but even cancer cells. So cancer cells are bad for us as well, and so our immune system can protect us against cancer cells. And due to modern medicine, sometimes our immune system will have to protect us against transplanted cells even though we don't want it to. So what is a virus? A virus is basically a shell of protein or lipid with an inner core of DNA or RNA or genetic material. And these viruses trick your cells to take them up, Once the virus gets inside your cell becomes infected, and it becomes a little virus-producing factory. This basically makes your cells sick, or sometimes can make your cells die. What about bacteria? Well, a bad bacteria can make toxins that can actually cause your cells to get sick or to die. So they basically injure your cells and tissues with toxins, and some bacteria can actually invade your cells and your tissue. Either way, it makes your cells sick and possibly kills them. So what about our body's defenses against these things? Well, we have what's called the innate or inborn defenses, which are not very specific, but it's good because they're programmed in you and you have them from birth. Basically, they don't have any memory, though. They respond the same each time. You also have these adaptive defenses, which are very specific and they have memory. And so actually, each time they respond better. The adaptive defenses are pretty much lymphocytes and antibodies. And we'll learn more about those later. So let's look first at the innate defenses, or non-specific defenses first. So let's say you're infected by something, a bacteria, a virus, or a parasite. The non-specific defenses will pretty much behave the same no matter what. So we have things like neutrophils, monocytes, or macrophages. So the neutrophils are attack cells. So they're going to attack the invaders, and they use cytotoxic chemicals that can try to destroy them. By releasing deadly chemicals and also ingesting the invaders, basically the neutrophils can protect you. When an immune cell ingests something, we call it phagocytosis. So neutrophils are great because there's lots of them, and they're very quick to respond. Macrophages work in a similar way, and they like to eat stuff up and ingest stuff too, which we call phagocytosis. So just like a neutrophil. The other thing the macrophages do, well, they'll alert your specific defenses or your lymphocytes about what's going on, that you've been basically attacked by something. And there's another cell we haven't learned about called the dendritic cell that works in a similar way. So basically, neutrophils are quick attack cells. They release deadly chemicals and they also ingest stuff. They're very quick to the scene, but they die pretty fast. Macrophages are similar and they also attack things and eat them up. But they also like to alert your specific defenses that there's some sort of invasion going on. I just wanted to note that if you ever have muscle injury or a heart attack or a joint injury, neutrophils and macrophages, their job too is to go in and sort of clean up that tissue injury. So let's say you had a heart attack. Neutrophils and macrophages would go in there and clean up the mess and clean up the tissue injury by ingesting the debris, ingesting sick or dying cells. Unfortunately, one of the things, especially neutrophils do, is not only do they clean up the mess and destroy the damaged cells, but they can also kill and damage healthy cells. So there's a lot of collateral damage when you activate these neutrophils and macrophages. Okay, so neutrophils, again, they'll eat up and ingest bacteria. They'll also release cytotoxic chemicals which can kill the bacteria. Macrophages, they will ingest the bacteria as well, killing them, but they'll also move throughout the body to alert your specific defenses that you've been invaded. And they actually do that by presenting little pieces of the invader, in this case the bacteria, on its cell surface. So the macrophage is great at alerting lymphocytes that you've been invaded and that they need to do a defense job to help out your body too. So hopefully one of those lymphocytes will respond and then help protect you. Dendritic cells are very similar to macrophages. They're less a defense cell and more an alert cell. So they ingest some of that bacteria and then present that little invader to your lymphocytes and let them know that something has attacked you. So in this way, macrophages and dendritic cells are really, really important alert cells. And who did they alert? Well, they alert the lymphocytes, which we'll learn are B cells and T cells, of the specific defenses. We also have some defense proteins that are made by our liver cells. We call these defense proteins complement proteins. Complement proteins circulate around in your bloodstream and your body's tissues, and they're usually inactive. But if you get an infection, for example, let's say you have a bacterial infection, those complement proteins can actually recognize surface markers on the bacteria and become activated. When they become activated, they recruit other complement proteins to the surface of the bacteria. And they're actually able to create these big giant openings in the surface of the bacteria membrane and can cause the cell to lyse. So basically, complement proteins can break apart invading cells like bacteria. Antibodies, which can actually bind and recognize and detect bacteria too, can also recruit complement. So in this way, the antibodies can recruit the complement and cause cell lysis. And this is how complement proteins actually got their name, because they basically help the action of antibodies. So antibodies can cause cell lysis only if they recruit complement. Immune cells like to make chemicals to help alert other immune cells or other body cells to what's going on. So there's lots and lots of immune chemicals released by our body cells and our immune cells. One of the more famous chemicals that our immune system makes is called interferon or interferons. So this can be made by your immune cells, but also your infected body cells. What do interferons do? Well, interferons can warn neighboring cells that you've been infected with a virus or a bacteria. Interferons can also activate the immune system. Some interferons can even turn off the immune system. So interferons are used medically to turn on and turn off your immune system by doctors and scientists. We also have basophils and related mast cells, which make lots and lots of chemicals called histamine. And histamine causes a lot of things you've probably noticed before. Histamine increases blood flow to a site of infection, and so that might cause redness. It also causes itching and swelling. So it makes those little capillaries leaky so that things like leukocytes and complement proteins can leak out of your blood vessels. And if you don't like that swelling, you might take an antihistamine. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you have an infection in your throat or an infection in your arm or leg, you may get a fever. One of the things that causes the fever are immune chemicals released by your immune cells. So let's say the immune chemicals are released in your arm or your leg. They can actually travel up to your hypothalamus in your brain and tell your body temperature to be higher, tell those neurons to reset your body temperature, and that's why you get a fever. I also wanted to mention when you're infected by parasites, textbooks usually always teach us that the eosinophil is the immune leukocyte or immune cell to respond to a parasitic infection, like these helminths that can actually infect your digestive tract. So eosinophils protect you with a chemical attack, which can seemingly kill those parasites. So eosinophils are also well known in causing diseases like allergies and asthma, or at least associated with them. Let's talk about our specific defenses. The specific defenses are the strongest, they have the longest memory, and it also is very specific. And specific defenses all relies upon our lymphocytes, which include our B cells and our T cells. And they're probably the strongest and best defenses. Let's start with B cells. So what do B cells do? B cells, when they get activated, make antibodies, which we learned were defense proteins that can respond and bind to a specific marker. So antibodies are very specific because each antibody is basically shaped to detect a specific marker or antigen. One of the kinds of T cells are called helper T cells. Helper T cells make immune chemicals to direct the entire immune response. So helper T cells really become some of the most important immune cells in our body because they orchestrate the entire immune response by releasing interleukins, interferons, and a whole host of chemicals that make all the other immune cells do their job better. The other kind of T cell is called a cytotoxic T cell. It's a killer, so it basically can kill cells. Well, what cells would it usually kill? Well, usually in our body we're talking about viral infected cells, or maybe even cancer cells. So any abnormal cells in your body can be targeted specifically and killed by cytotoxic T cells. And of course, this would be involved in transplantation too if we had a foreign cell in our body. So remember, these lymphocytes are going to be the specific defenses. Where do you find your lymphocytes? Well, a lot of our lymphocytes are found in lymph nodes and tonsils. So let's say you had a bacterial infection in your throat. The first things there to defend you would be something like a neutrophil or a macrophage. One of those macrophages might then go and travel away from your throat to somewhere like your neck or your chest into one of those lymph nodes. And that little macrophage would basically alert the lymphocytes in that lymph node that you've been attacked by something. And it does that by presenting little pieces of the bacteria called markers. And remember that markers can also be called antigens. Well, all the different lymphocytes that are in that lymph node, probably only a small group of those have been genetically programmed to recognize this bacterial marker that you've been infected with. And so the macrophage shows the marker to all the different lymphocytes till it finds the right lymphocyte that can recognize that bacterial marker. The rest of them will ignore it because they don't recognize that marker and that antigen. But that one little lymphocyte will become activated. So basically, your lymphocytes are genetically programmed with specific proteins so they can only detect one specific marker or one specific antigen. Once you activate that little lymphocyte, it's going to make copies of itself through cell division. So we're going to make basically hundreds or thousands of copies of that activated lymphocyte. And so the memory cells will wait maybe till next year or a couple months when you get attacked by the same thing. So that's the idea of immunity, that you have memory due to these activated lymphocytes. And then of course you have the clone army, which can go out and defend you right away. When you activate B cells' jobs are to make antibodies. So since we activated this one little specific B cell, it divided and created many copies of itself. Most of those cells then are going to become antibody-making factories or antibody-making cells. And those antibodies then will be secreted out of those B cells. They'll circulate and defend you. So how can antibodies defend you? So remember, you are infected in this example by a bacteria, and that little bacteria had a marker on its surface that activated your lymphocytes that created specific antibodies to protect you. So these antibodies will circulate around in your bloodstream and in your tissues, and they'll look for that marker or antigen specific for that bacteria. One thing antibodies can do is to recruit complement proteins. The complement proteins can punch holes in the cell membrane, causing the bacteria to die. The other thing the antibodies can do is to basically surround the bacteria and neutralize it so that it can't invade your tissues. Antibodies will also clump up the invader, in this case the bacteria. By clumping them together, it helps the actual neutrophils and macrophages know what to target and destroy. It also helps in phagocytosis, so that cells like the macrophage can eat those bacteria up and kill them. So bacteria have a lot of powerful defense actions, but they're very specific. They will only work against the original marker that they were designed against. So imagine you have billions and billions of lymphocytes. Anytime you get a specific infection, only a small group of those lymphocytes are programmed to defend you against that specific invader. So of the billions and billions of T cells and B cells, only some will ever recognize the specific threat or markers that you get invaded by. The rest will wait for the next time when you get invaded by something they can recognize. It turns out that each of your little lymphocytes makes a unique protein receptor, and that protein receptor will only detect one specific marker or antigen. Your DNA, or your genetics, determines the structure of those little protein receptors, and so each little lymphocyte is pre-programmed only to respond to one specific marker. So again, if you're infected by a virus, only a small number of your lymphocytes in your body will hopefully be programmed to respond to that specific marker from that virus. The rest will not respond. Again, the specificity comes from this. You have markers, or antigens, in anything that invades you. Hopefully, you will respond to those markers, but you don't really know what you're going to get infected with, right? You don't know if you're going to get infected with this bacteria or a different bacteria or virus. Well, luckily, hopefully, you're basically born with lymphocytes that can detect anything, any marker that you get invaded with. And those specific lymphocytes will respond to what you get infected with. If you are infected by something that your T cells and your B cells can't recognize, well, then you would be defenseless in terms of your specific defenses, and they wouldn't respond. The next learning objective is describe the body's response to a viral infection. So let's say you have a respiratory tract virus, something like the flu. Those little virus particles will invade your respiratory epithelial cells, and once they invade those cells become sick and basically become little virus factories, producing more viruses, which can then go on and infect more of your cells. So the infected cells become sick, they can die, and of course they can produce more viruses, which can make the infection even worse. So what is our goal in a viral infection? Basically, we need to kill the viral infected cells, but we also want to neutralize any virus that's around. We'll kill the viral infected cells with T cells. We'll neutralize the virus with antibodies. We'll coordinate this entire response with helper T cells. So remember, B cells can make specific antibodies that can detect that virus. Neutralizing it basically is hiding it away from your cells by binding to it. If the virus is neutralized, it can't infect more cells. Helper T cells will help coordinate the immune response by making interleukins and interferons and other immune chemicals that signal all the other cells to do their job. The cytotoxic T cells, well, their job is to kill the virus-infected cells. One thing to consider is, how do we know which cells are infected by a virus? Well, luckily, your little cells place viral particles or markers on their cell surface. Normal cells would not do that. Also, our nonspecific defenses are in there helping defend us. Neutrophils, macrophages, and dendritic cells. The macrophage and the dendritic cells will be nice and alert your specific defenses that there's a viral infection. And they'll look for the right T cells and B cells to activate for that specific virus. Once those T cells and B cells become activated, then they'll defend you. The B cells will make the antibodies specific for that virus and the virus markers that you've been infected with. The cytotoxic T cells, or TC cells, well, they're going to try to kill only your viral infected cells, and they'll look at markers on the surface of your cells until they detect viral infected cells and virus markers, and they'll specifically kill those cells which have been infected. They do this by releasing chemicals which specifically cause apoptosis, or death of your little viral infected cells. So that's the cytotoxic T cells. The helper T cells will simply release immune chemicals like interleukins and interferons that tell all the other immune cells to do their job better. It tells B cells, macrophages, cytotoxic T cells, even neutrophils, to do their job. It does this by releasing chemicals called interleukins and also interferons. Some of these immune chemicals are going to travel to your brain and your hypothalamus and cause you to have a fever. Some famous viruses you've probably heard of. The human papillomavirus can cause epithelial cells to become cancerous, especially in your genitals and your mouth and your anus. Rhinovirus causes the cold. Norovirus causes that vomiting diarrhea virus you hear a lot about. Influenza is a respiratory virus. And of course, we'll talk about others like HIV and hepatitis. One of the things to consider is when you get the influenza virus, it's really an upper respiratory tract virus that affects your throat and your airways, but it makes you feel awful all over your whole body. So one of the things to consider is that when those immune cells are fighting that local infection in your respiratory tract, the immune chemicals like interleukins and interferons get released into your bloodstream and travel throughout your whole body. Some of those interleukins can go to your brain and cause you to have a fever. Some of them will go to your peripheral neurons and make you feel achy. Others will go to your brain and make you lose your appetite. So they travel around your whole body, making you feel sometimes awful all over. What about vaccines? How do vaccines work? Well, vaccines often are an injection of either bacterial or viral markers or antigens. Your immune system then responds to those markers just like as if you had an infection. So the macrophages may then go alert your lymphocytes. The lymphocytes then get activated and can make things like antibodies, specific antibodies against whatever markers were part of that vaccination. So again, we activate our immune cells. Your immune cells act as if you were infected, but really you get immunity without getting the infection. So in that way, vaccines trick your immune system into creating immunity without really having an infection. The next learning objective is describe the body's defenses to a bacterial infection. So remember, bacteria are these single-cell organisms that live on our skin, in our mouth, in parts of our digestive and reproductive tract. So these bacteria are often good bacteria that live on us our whole lives, but some bad bacteria can cause localized and even systemic illness. So they can cause destruction and death of our cells and our tissue. They can cause inflammation. They do this by releasing things like toxins or sometimes even invading our cells. So our defense goals with bacteria is simply kill the bacteria and also neutralize and target the bacteria. So neutrophils and macrophages are great at phagocytosis, which can include eating up the bacteria. Antibodies can help target the bacteria. Helper T cells can help coordinate our attack against the bacterial infection with interleukins. So remember, the neutrophils release cytotoxic chemicals which can kill bacteria. They can also ingest them. Tissue macrophages can ingest the bacteria, killing them. The tissue macrophages, in addition to killing the bacteria, will also work with dendritic cells to ingest the bacteria and then take those bacterial markers and migrate around the body to various lymph nodes. And so by showing the bacterial markers or antigens to all the little lymphocytes, hopefully the right lymphocytes that are genetically programmed to respond to this bacteria get activated. So the B cells and the T cells get activated. Eventually we make lots and lots of antibodies. The antibodies circulate around the body. Eventually those antibodies will reach the bacteria that they're designed against, bind to the surface of those bacteria. They'll neutralize the bacteria, also recruit complement proteins. The complement proteins can punch holes in those cells, causing them to lyse, destroying the bacteria. Also, the antibody labeling of the bacteria make it easier for phagocytosis by cells like macrophages. Antibiotics are drugs designed to kill bacterial cells and hopefully not human cells. So antibiotics are great at killing bacteria, but they also kill the good bacteria often, as well as the bad bacteria in our bodies. Also, the overuse of antibiotics has led to antibiotic resistance, meaning that there are strains of bacteria now that cannot be killed by antibiotics. Some of this was due to overuse of antibiotics in treating viral infections, because a virus will not be killed by antibiotics. One thing to keep in mind is once you've activated your immune system, those antibodies can continue to be made for months or years, as well as those memory cells exist. So you'll have an increased immune response anytime you get a second infection with the same pathogen. And finally, I wanted to note that sometimes the bad guys win. So sometimes the bacteria or the virus are able to infect your body so that it makes your organs and your cells sick, and it can even lead to death. So sometimes our immune system doesn't win. So in cases of HIV, hepatitis, even influenza, we can actually get so sick that we die. All right, that's the end. I will see you guys